June 1944. The beaches of Normandy had been taken, but victory was strangled by the thick, ancient hedgerows of rural France. Every field became a fortress, every hedge a wall of death. American tanks, designed for open ground, were slaughtered trying to push through. Crews called it the Green Hell. But then, one sergeant with a welder's torch and a stubborn mind built something the army never could, a machine that turned nature itself into rubble. The hedgerows of Normandy were unlike anything the Americans had ever seen. Centuries old, they weren't just bushes. They were earthen fortresses, thick walls of tangled roots, stone and mud, standing up to 10 feet high, lined every field and lane. From above, it looked like a patchwork quilt of green, but on the ground, it was a maze of death. When the Allies broke through the beaches after D-Day, they expected to roll across France in days. Instead, they found themselves trapped in narrow lanes where a tank couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. The moment a Sherman nosed out of a gap, hidden German anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts tore it apart. Infantry were pinned down, and progress slowed to a crawl. Yards gained at the cost of lives. The Germans, veterans of defensive warfare, knew exactly what they were doing. Every hedgerow concealed machine gun nests in camouflaged positions. They waited in silence for the metallic groan of tank tracks, and then unleashed hell. Morale began to crack. The American soldiers, so full of momentum after Omaha and Utah, were now bleeding for inches. Commanders scrambled for answers, new tactics, new approaches, but none could solve the simple problem. How do you drive through a wall of earth? And in the 2nd Armored Division, a young sergeant named Curtis G. Cullen watched yet another tank die trying to climb a hedgerow. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an inventor, but he was tired of watching friends die to dirt. That night, in the glow of a welding torch, Cullen began to build something no one had ever seen before. Curtis G. Cullen was a quiet man from New York, serving as a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. He wasn't a trained engineer, but he was a soldier with a problem. And soldiers with problems often become inventors by necessity. Day after day, he saw Sherman tanks destroyed trying to climb over Normandy's ancient hedgerows. Their exposed bellies made perfect targets for German gunners. The solution had to be simple, tough, and fast to make in the field. One humid evening, while his unit rested near a hedgerow-lined field, Cullen studied the twisted wreck of a German roadblock made of steel beams. The sight gave him an idea. What if a tank could cut through the hedgerow instead of climbing over it? The next morning, he scavenged the battlefield. Broken steel from destroyed obstacles, bent angle irons, and bits of German beach defenses. Anything sharp and strong. He and a few mechanics dragged the scrap back to their camp. Using a field welder, they began shaping it into a crude device. 4 sharpened metal prongs welded to the front of a Sherman tank. It looked like a set of tusks, ugly and menacing. When Cullen presented it to his commanding officer, the reaction was predictable. A skeptical laugh, a shrug, and finally, permission to test it, mostly out of curiosity. The test came that afternoon. Cullen climbed into the driver's seat, heart pounding. Ahead of him loomed a wall of thick green hedgerow, the kind that had stopped tanks for weeks. He revved the engine, shifted gears, and gunned it forward. The prongs hit the hedge with a thunderous crack. Dirt and roots exploded into the air. The Sherman didn't climb. It plowed through. In seconds, it had burst out the other side, leaving a gaping hole wide enough for infantry and vehicles to follow. The men stood in silence for a moment, then erupted in cheers. For the first time since D-Day, they had beaten the hedgerows. Word of Cullen's invention spread faster than gunfire. Officers called it a hedge-breaching device. Soldiers just called it the Rhino. Within days, Cullen's squad was demonstrating the design to engineers across the 2nd Armored Division. Welders worked around the clock, attaching rhino tusks to Shermans using whatever scrap they could find. By mid-July 1944, hundreds of tanks rolled across Normandy with Cullen's creation mounted on their hulls. Crude, improvised, but brutally effective. The results were immediate. Instead of getting caught at every field boundary, Rhino-equipped Shermans could smash straight through hedgerows, catching German defenders off guard. Positions that had once been untouchable were overrun in minutes. Infantry advanced behind them, protected and emboldened. For the first time since the landings, American forces could fight the war their way, fast, aggressive, mobile. But Cullen's invention didn't just change tactics. It changed morale. Tank crews began to paint names on their rhinos. Hedgehog, the Green Reaper, the Cutter. Each one became a symbol of defiance. a testament to the ingenuity of soldiers who refused to be trapped by terrain. Cullen's idea had turned the tide of the Normandy campaign, and soon, his makeshift device would play a key role in one of the most decisive offensives in the European theater, Operation Cobra. By late July 1944, the hedgerow stalemate had nearly broken the American advance. For over 6 brutal weeks, they had fought yard by yard across the Normandy countryside. Every small field, every tree line had been soaked in blood. Commanders needed a breakthrough, something that would shatter the German front and open France to Allied armor. That something was Operation Cobra. General Omar Bradley's plan was simple in concept, but immense in scale. It called for a concentrated aerial bombardment followed by a massive ground assault. The goal: punch a hole through the German 7th Army's defenses near St. Lo and unleash the fast-moving U.S. armored divisions beyond. But there was one question every commander feared to ask out loud. What if the hedgerows stopped them again? In the days before the operation, hundreds of tanks were fitted with Cullen's steel tusks. Welders worked through the night, sparks lighting up the darkened fields of Normandy. Tank crews painted their makeshift plows black with soot, giving them a menacing look under the early morning mist. Cullen himself, now promoted, moved from unit to unit, checking fittings, giving advice, and explaining how to charge through a hedge without exposing the tank's belly. On July 25, 1944, the morning sky thundered with the roar of bombers. Over 3,000 aircraft of the U.S. 8th Air Force blanketed the German lines with high explosives. The ground shook like an earthquake. Whole fields vanished under clouds of smoke and dust. German communication lines were cut, command posts obliterated, and entire units thrown into confusion. When the bombardment lifted, the order went out. Move! The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions surged forward. Tanks with Cullen's Rhinos led the assault. As they reached the first hedgerows, they didn't stop or climb. They charged. The sharp tusks bit deep into the earthen walls. Dirt and roots flew in all directions. The Shermans burst through, one after another, smashing open paths for infantry and support vehicles. For the first time since D-Day, the hedgerows weren't obstacles, they were doorways. German defenders, dazed from the bombardment, scrambled to react. Their carefully planned ambushes failed as the Rhinos tore through their fields faster than they could reposition. Machine gun nests that had once pinned down entire companies were overrun within minutes. American forces advanced 5 miles in a single day, more than they had managed in the previous 6 weeks combined. To the soldiers on the ground, the transformation was almost surreal. The terrain that had once seemed unbeatable was suddenly powerless. It felt, one tanker recalled, like the whole war had changed overnight. By July 27th, the breakthrough widened. Bradley's armored columns poured through the gap like a flood. German lines collapsed under the pressure. Thousands of enemy troops surrendered or retreated south in disarray. The once impregnable Bocage was behind them. In the chaos of the breakout, Cullen's simple invention became a legend. Tank crews who had once cursed the hedgerows now laughed as they drove through them, shouting over the roar of their engines. Infantrymen followed close behind, cheering the Rhinos that led the way. As reports flowed in, word of the success reached Bradley himself. The general asked to meet the man responsible. When Cullen was brought before him, a grease-stained sergeant with welding scars still on his hands, Bradley reportedly said, "Sergeant, your idea may have won this war for us." That was an exaggeration. Perhaps, but not by much. The Rhino had given the U.S. Army exactly what it needed: momentum. With the hedgerows breached, armored divisions could finally fight in open terrain where they excelled. Operation Cobra didn't just free Normandy. It opened the road to Paris, and from there, to the heart of Germany. Behind every advance was a tank with steel tusks, tearing through France one hedgerow at a time. But while the world celebrated the speed of the American advance, few knew the name of the man who had made it possible. Curtis Cullen's invention spread across the entire Allied front, adapted and improved by countless units. Yet his name was rarely mentioned in official reports. His work was practical, not glamorous, a field modification, not a headline. Still, among the crews who fought with the Rhinos, there was no doubt. Whenever a tank burst through a hedge and kept moving, they remembered the sergeant who refused to stop. Cullen's simple act of battlefield ingenuity had done what entire divisions of engineers could not. It had turned the very walls of Normandy into rubble and reshaped the way the Allies fought in Western Europe. But the war wasn't over yet. The Rhinos would soon carry their tusks beyond Normandy, across France, through Belgium, and into the heart of Germany itself. And Cullen? He would watch from afar as his crude invention helped crush the Reich from the inside out. The fields of Normandy were behind them now. By August 1944, the Allied advance had become a tidal wave. Towns that had once been symbols of stubborn German resistance, Saint-Lô, Avranches, Coutances, were now little more than ruins in the wake of the American breakout. The road to Paris lay open, and with it, the fate of Western Europe. Everywhere they went, the Rhinos led the way. The crude iron tusks welded to Sherman tanks, born from Curtis Cullen's late-night welding torch, had become standard across the armored divisions. What began as one man's desperate improvisation was now mass-produced in field workshops and supply depots across France. Each division modified the design in its own way. Some added extra spikes for cutting deeper roots. Others reinforced the welds with scavenged German steel. A few even painted the tusks with shark teeth or slogans like Bocage Breaker and Rhino's Revenge. Whatever the variation, the result was always the same. A Sherman that could turn any hedge, wall, or barricade into splinters. By early August, General Patton's Third Army, newly unleashed from the Cotentin Peninsula, roared across the open plains of France. His tanks, many sporting Cullen's devices, advanced at speeds the Germans couldn't match. Roads, rivers, and hedges no longer slowed them. What had been a stagnant, grinding slugfest had turned into a war of movement, fast, lethal, and relentless. In just 2 weeks, Patton's forces advanced over 100 miles. The German 7th Army, trapped in what became known as the Falaise Pocket, was decimated. Allied armor poured in from all sides, collapsing the last remnants of organized resistance in Normandy. And leading many of those armored thrusts were tanks with the unmistakable, jagged silhouettes of Cullen's Rhinos. The effect on German morale was devastating. Once confident in their mastery of the Bocage terrain, they now faced tanks that seemed unstoppable, machines that didn't hesitate or slow, that simply tore through the countryside as if the land itself had turned against them. Veterans who had boasted of their defensive skill now found their positions overrun before they could even reload. By the time Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, the Rhino had become a symbol of the new Allied way of war. Fast, creative, adaptive. It wasn't just a piece of metal welded to a tank. It was proof that innovation could come from the front lines, not just from factories or laboratories. Curtis Cullen himself watched this transformation with quiet pride. By then, he had been promoted and assigned to assist engineering officers in spreading his design. He moved with the advancing forces, visiting workshops, refining blueprints, and making sure the cutters were mounted correctly. To the men who met him, he wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. No medals, no speeches, just a wiry, grease-stained soldier who talked about steel, angles, and torque like a farmer discussing the weather. When asked later how he'd come up with it, Cullen simply said, "We were tired of dying at the hedges." As Allied forces crossed the Seine and pushed toward Belgium, the Rhinos went with them. Though the dense hedgerows faded away, the idea behind the device, that frontline soldiers could engineer their own salvation, took root across the army. Infantrymen began modifying weapons, vehicles, even uniforms based on battlefield needs. A culture of ingenuity had been born. By September, the European campaign had entered a new phase. Operation Cobra had given birth to a lightning war that swept across France. What had once been an army bogged down in mud and foliage now raced across open country, the full industrial might of the Allies finally unleashed. Cullen's invention faded into the background as new technologies took center stage, improved tank guns, better armor, faster logistics. But its legacy remained etched in steel, both literally and figuratively. Every Rhino that rolled across Europe carried a small plaque welded near its tusks, modified per Sergeant Cullen's design. Yet for all the praise, Cullen himself never sought fame. When the war ended, he returned home quietly, his name barely mentioned in official histories. No parades, no medals, just a man who had done what needed to be done. It wasn't until years later that historians began to piece together the full impact of his work. Without Cullen's hedge cutter, the breakout from Normandy might have dragged on for weeks longer. Every extra day in the Bocage would have cost thousands of lives and delayed the liberation of France. His crude iron tusks had shortened the war in the West, not by invention in a laboratory, but by creativity born from desperation. In post-war interviews, generals like Omar Bradley and engineers from the Ordnance Department admitted as much. One officer wrote, "Cullen's device changed the tempo of our campaign. It turned the impossible into routine." Today, preserved Shermans fitted with original Rhino cutters stand in museums across Europe and the United States. Their steel prongs, rusted but intact, are silent witnesses to the moment when the ingenuity of one soldier changed the course of a campaign. When visitors look at them, they see a strange, almost primitive piece of metalwork. But to those who understand the war, those crude spikes tell a story of fear, frustration, and a simple idea that saved countless lives. The war moved on, through Belgium, across the Rhine, and into Germany itself. But the spirit of Cullen's invention never left the men who saw it in action. It reminded them that even in the most industrialized war in human history, sometimes victory still depended on one man, a torch, and a spark of imagination. By the time the final shots were fired in Europe in May 1945, Cullen had been reassigned, his invention now part of official Army engineering doctrine. He didn't live to see his legacy honored. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen died in 1947, just 2 years after the war, in an automobile accident. He was 32 years old. He never knew that in later decades, his name would be remembered in armored museums, military textbooks, and the grateful words of tankers who had survived because of his idea. To them, he wasn't just an inventor. He was proof that courage could take many forms, not just charging into battle, but facing an impossible problem and refusing to accept defeat. Cullen's hedge cutter didn't just slice through earth and roots. It carved through fear itself. And for the men of Normandy, that made all the difference. In the grand archives of war, the names that echo loudest are often those of generals and battles: Patton, Normandy, Cobra. But history, if you look closely, is filled with smaller names, the ones etched not in marble, but in metal and memory. Curtis G. Cullen was one of those names. He never commanded an army or wrote a strategy. He didn't invent a new weapon in a factory. He was a sergeant who welded 4 pieces of scrap steel to a tank and, in doing so, changed the pace of a war. His creation didn't look heroic. No polish, no design, no glory. But it worked. And in war, that's what mattered most. In the months after Operation Cobra, Cullen's Rhino became legend among tank crews. They spoke of it in the same breath as luck and courage. Some carried small fragments of broken cutters as good luck charms. Others swore their tank was alive, that the Rhino gave it a will of its own. When the war ended and Europe fell silent, the Rhinos were left behind, rusting in French fields, abandoned in Belgian forests, sleeping beside the very hedgerows they once destroyed. Farmers used them as anchors for fences or tool sheds. Children played on their hulks, unaware that those twisted prongs had once carved the road to liberation. Decades later, when historians returned to tell the story of the Normandy campaign, they found that hidden beneath the thunder of bombers and the roar of tanks was the quiet spark of a single idea, an idea that turned despair into momentum. Cullen's invention proved that even in an age of vast machines and endless production, ingenuity still belonged to the individual soldier. His welding torch had done what entire design bureaus could not. Today, a handful of Rhinos still stand in museums, one in Normandy, another at Fort Benning, their jagged tusks dark with age. Visitors walk past them without always understanding what they represent. But for those who know, they stand as a symbol of one of the most important truths of war, that sometimes victory begins not with orders from above, but with courage from below. Curtis G. Cullen's name is not carved on monuments or shouted in parades, but his fingerprints are on every mile the Allies gained after Normandy, on every field that once seemed impassable, on every soldier who learned that even the simplest idea can turn the tide. He didn't just cut through the hedgerows of France. He cut through history itself.